Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. This is Kathy, and today I'll be sharing another Valentine's Day card without using the traditional reds and pinks. I'll be using the Giraffe Smiles stamp set, the Giraffe stencil, the wonky stitched rectangle dies, all from Whimsy, and I'll also be using the stacked heart dies from Honeybee Stamps. And the first thing I did was I had to create a mask so that I could do some stenciling. So I ran a piece of regular printer paper through my Gemini Junior with the heart die from Honeybee Stamps. On the back side of the printer paper, I used my Zig two-way glue pen and just applied glue around the edge of the heart and then a little bit around the outer edges and the corners. The Zig two-way glue pen becomes repositionable once it's completely dry. So after I had the glue applied to the negative frame of the die cut heart, I set that off to the side to dry. And while that was drying, I stamped the giraffe onto a piece of Nina Desert Storm cardstock using my favorite things, milk chocolate hybrid ink. Both the cardstock and the ink are Copic friendly, and I'm going to be coloring that little guy in using some Copics. All of the colors that I use for the giraffe will be listed in the description below, as well as all of the products that I used. One thing to keep in mind when you're coloring on the Desert Storm cardstock, the colors look a little bit odd when you first start coloring, but once the ink dries, it usually just works out just fine. The yellows are kind of a weird color on the Desert Storm. I kind of just did swatches off on a piece of scratch paper to see how they would dry on the Desert Storm cardstock, because it seems that the Desert Storm kind of mutes the tones a little bit. Anyway, about the coloring, for his little nose, the front part of his nose, I used YR and Y21. For his face and his body, I used YR23, and I did my darkest shadowing with YR27, and I concentrated the YR27 on his ears and on either side of his face, and then a little bit under his chin, and I only used the YR27 down one side of his, like down the left side of his body. I blended that out with the YR24 and then went in to blend all of that together with the YR23. I did add some shading on the bottom of his legs that are sticking out, and then later decided that I needed to darken up his belly that's behind his two front legs. For the spots, I started with E37, and I just kind of colored them in. I did leave a little bit of uncolored space so that I could go over it with the E29, just so that the spots had a little bit of a two-tone look. The spots that were under his chin and down the left side of his body, I did color those in more with the darker color, the E29, just because I was trying to keep that shading consistent down the left side of his body. For his antlers and his hooves, I used E47 and E44. The E47 for his hooves I just did along the very bottom. For his antlers, I did the very top and then a tiny little line down the side. After I was done with the coloring, the glue on the back side of my mask had dried, so now it's repositionable. The copy paper, by the way, was cut down to a smidgen smaller than 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and the cardstock that I adhered that to is also Nina Desert Storm, and that is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I cut the mask slightly smaller so that I could have a tiny border of the Desert Storm around it, just so I could see where I was placing the mask to get it centered as much as possible. Once I had the mask in place, I used some painter's tape to hold it to the giraffe stencil and started with mustard seed distress oxide ink and did a pretty good layer over the entire heart. I did want to leave it a little bit lighter in the center of the heart, so I put a little bit more pressure on the outer edges of the heart. After I was done with the mustard seed, I brought in Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink and just blended that around the very edges of the heart itself. I removed the stencil and the mask and then ran that panel through my Gemini Junior using the largest die from the Wonky Stitched Rectangle die set. After I had that panel die cut, I decided it was time to stamp the sentiment. I used the stamp platform for this just to make sure I had the sentiment straight and to make sure that I got a good impression. And after I had placed it down and picked it up with the door of my stamp platform, I noticed that it wasn't quite straight, so I straightened it out using the grid lines on the lid of the stamp platform. I inked up the sentiment in the same milk chocolate ink from My Favorite Things and stamped that onto that panel. I knew that my card base was going to be the Nina Desert Storm cardstock as well, and I did want to have a little bit of separation between the panel with the stenciled heart and the card base, so I used an ink blending tool and the Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink and just inked up the edges a little bit. I wanted to make sure that I didn't go in too far, which is why I used the ink blending tool. I have a little bit more control, or I feel like I have a little bit more control with the ink blending tool instead of dragging the ink pad across the cardstock, which is another option. So the card base, as I mentioned, is from Nina Desert Storm cardstock. It's cut to 4 1/4 by 11 and scored at the 5.5 inch mark. I folded that in half and was lazy to pull out my bone folder, so I just used an acrylic block to make that crease nice and sharp. I adhered the stenciled panel straight down to the card using my AdTech tape runner. I had previously die cut the little giraffe using the coordinating die and added a little bit of foam tape to the back side of him and put him in place on front of the card. And that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.